So, yeah, we can start. So it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you for the second public lecture of our fall series at the NCCR on the Move. Tonight, Facundo Chavez Penillas from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights will discuss the kind of barriers that migrants with disabilities face in their access to employment, social protection, and argue in favor of a human rights-based approach of social protection systems to end poverty for persons with disabilities. Facundo Chavez Penillas is the Human Rights and Disability Advisor of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2013, if I'm not mistaken. He's a lawyer with graduate studies on business law and human rights law. Before his current position, Facundo worked in the Disability Department at the Ombudsperson Office of the City of Buenos Aires, and also in a corporate law firm. He was also a member of several organizations of persons with disabilities at the national, regional, and also international levels before working for the United Nations. Before giving him the floor, I would like to express my warm thanks to Leslie Ader, our doctoral student at the University of Neuchâtel, who has worked incredibly hard to organize this lecture and also the workshop that will take place tomorrow. Leslie has been working with a lot of enthusiasm, I have to say, on the topic, and thanks to her, we can have Facundo presenting his knowledge and his practical experience tonight. Dear Leslie, I'm extremely grateful for your generous efforts in setting up this event. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Lisa Borelli, who is here with us, our postdoctoral researcher at the NCCR on the Move, and who has provided us with a lot of support in the organization of these events, and who has accepted to discuss Facundo's presentation. Facundo will be speaking for about 30 to 45 minutes. It's kind of flexible, as I told him. And then Lisa will have about 10 minutes to discuss his presentation. Finally, we will open the discussion to the audience until 7:45, and I will moderate the discussion so you can put your comments either on the chat or raise your virtual hand and ask your question directly to Facundo. Facundo, your talk is entitled Migrants with Disabilities and Social Protection, and I very much look forward to listening to you. The virtual floor is yours. You can go ahead.
Thanks, Robin, and thank everybody for the work that you put to organize this call. I would have loved to be there today, but unfortunately, it's been very demanding at the end of the year. And we're still trying to work through it. So I would like to start by first asking you, at least the ones that are online in the platform, if you are familiarized with the human rights-based approach to disability. You can do a thumbs up kind of thing if you are into it. If you're not, just let me know. That would be fine. So I would like to start by presenting a bit the human rights-based approach to disability, what it means, and how it got here, really through time. As you know, the disability rights agenda, it's a fairly new agenda compared to other agendas on group-specific issues. And I would say that it started in the late 60s and early 70s to take the form that we know today. Up to that moment, the social models that existed or the constructions on persons with disabilities were very much rooted on the fact that persons with disabilities to be part of society had to overcome individual characteristics, right? And this was framed first through what's called the charity model of disability, was basically looking at persons with disabilities as these poor people that needs, beneficency and that need to require and require the support of, the church or some other structures. Very much looking at a charity in favor of persons with disabilities. And it was very much treating people with disabilities as objects of protection, objects of care, and social protection systems didn't even consider persons with disabilities up to this point. These systems continue to exist today in many legislations around the world and many social protection systems. So when we are talking about these different models from now on, please keep in mind that all of these models currently coexist in many systems, and in many cases they overlap between each other, right? So have that point in mind. Later in time, and particularly after the Industrial Revolution and World War II, social protection systems started to shift, right? And the main purpose of the logic of participation was very much connected to the logic of being a productive employee or productive worker. And social protection systems were designed around facilitating the participation of workers in development, right? So what is the situation at that point with regard to persons with disabilities? Well, the conceptualization of persons with disabilities also changed, right? And we moved from these charity perspectives to what we call the medical model of disability, basically saying that if you are a person that has an impairment, to be part of society, you will require to be fixed, right? So rehabilitation systems, medical structures were basically the lead in terms of policy implementation to support the participation of persons with disabilities in the system and in society in general. And it was very much limited to that, right? So the whole story from a policy perspective on persons with disabilities was focused on the capacity of, overcome your impairment, either through rehabilitation or medical attention, in a way that would allow you to be part of the system. This is kind of the integration approach that doesn't still reflect the situation of persons with disabilities. And it was because of the larger social movements that started to mobilize in the 60s and 70s, including people of African descent, LGBTI, initiatives and movements that were starting at that point, women's rights movements and so on. It was that the people with disabilities themselves started to see that what we were facing at that moment, and we continue to face, it's very much related to social injustice, right? And to structures of oppression that are starting to make the case to the next shift in the sociological perspective of disability. That is what we call the social model of disability. So the social model of disability understands persons with disabilities in an interaction, right? So it puts on one side people with impairments, on the other side society and the barriers that the design of societies are imposing on persons with disabilities. And that's what we call disability, right? That the result of that interaction, it's what we call disability. And this is similar to what we call racism, to what we call gender discrimination, where you can identify a specific group, and then when you are contrasting the life experience of that group against the larger population and looking at the structures in society, that specific population by design, by social design, it's being excluded from participating on equal basis with others in the communities where they live, right? So these conceptualizations, right, the charity approach, the medical approach, are very much embedded in social protection systems and in structures, right? And what I would say that really characterizes these perspectives of from the charity model and the medical model are basically three, right? The first one is that people with disabilities cannot work, and because they cannot work, then whatever kind of a structure of social protection should aim at two main objectives. The first one is to provide for support, and if you are not a worker, then you are not necessary in the society. And as a consequence of that, a number of policies were developed connected to segregated structures of support. So what we see today is, as a consequence of that, we see institutionalization, segregated education, segregated employment, and all kinds of structures that are really not making the person with disabilities part of the mainstream, right? And that has been the existing policies pretty much all over the world until the until this started to change, I would say, some 15 years ago, right? There is a long way to get to where the human rights model wants to go, and this is the largest piece of the situation. So social protection systems are designed either for segregation or for income replacement. They are not designed to enable persons with disabilities to actually be part of community life, right? What is it that the social model does? So the social model, by changing the logic and by saying this is not an individual problem, this is a collective problem that we have as society, it starts a new process of conversations and discussions, particularly within the disability movement, to see how a concrete change can be brought to the situation of persons with disabilities through changing the beliefs of persons with disabilities, and also of changing the political systems and policies that were developed around those previous beliefs to a new perspective, right? And that's where we are today. From a social protection point of view, what the human rights model proposes is exactly the opposite, right? So what it does is to say, what it does say is to put persons with disabilities at the center of community life, at the center of society participation. And to do that, it addresses three main areas. The first one is to explain that the reason why persons with disabilities are living in poverty in large numbers, it's because persons with disabilities face what we call disability extra costs, right? And disability extra costs are those costs that are associated with participating in the community on an everyday life. And these are connected, for example, to accessible transport, to human support that people with disabilities may require. If you have in a household that has a person with disabilities, statistics are showing that the household income, net income, is 20% lower than the general income of other households in the same segments. So what we are looking at is at extra cost as the main reason why persons with disabilities are largely represented among the poor. So the first thing that social protections should be looking at to overcome poverty and to enable participation in society is to cover the extra costs of disability. The second big objective it's to look at the structures of support, right? And what does it mean? Currently, the structures of support are, as I said before, looking at how you exclude persons with disabilities and you provide them with an income replacement structure, a place where to live that is commonly segregated, separate the structures for moving around in cities, local governments, looking at segregated structures of housing, as I said before. And there are two large civil rights that are involved into this, which are connected to decision making, so legal capacity, and to be forced to live in some of these segregated settings, as it happens, for example, in structures connected to mental health law, or as it happens in structures connected to social care institutions, right? So, and these are the 6 main pillars that we need to be looking at from a social protection point of view. So human support, including the support that is required to households, so they can support persons with disabilities, assistive technologies, transportation, housing, legal capacity, and restrictions in terms of the choosing and impositions in terms of the choosing of where and with whom to live, right? So let's keep these 6 items in mind as we move forward. Finally, these are the kind of the main pillars for achieving what the human rights model would propose and to ensure that persons with disabilities can be part of development processes, right? And this is considered in the human rights model and in the social model as a way of moving forward. Why are we talking about the social model and the human rights model in separate terms? The first one is because social models are designed, are explained, let's say, through different lenses, right? So this is very much a sociological description of the reality of persons with disabilities. And you have as many social models as sociologists that are explaining the situation of persons with disabilities in a given context, right? So you can see, for example, the explanation of the social model that is coming from England and Nordic countries, that it's much more looking at the Marxist description of the social model, looking at systems of oppression, system of imposition, and how that operates in the larger structure of industrialized or becoming industrialized countries at that moment in the 60s and 70s. And that's a way of describing the social model, right? Another way of describing the social model may be coming, for example, from countries like the US, where persons with disabilities are seen from the lenses of civil rights. And as you know, civil rights is a structure of non-discrimination mainly, that it's looking at, that started with the participation of people of African descent, African Americans in particular, in the system in the US. But it's not really looking at the larger picture of welfare and other structures around that. So what you have from, you know, the understanding of the social model from a US point of view, it's really to be a consumer on equal basis with others, and that's the larger framework that you can see there. Other social model and post-colonialist perspectives in Africa or in Latin America are presenting the description of persons with disabilities from a much more larger historical perspective. And in many cases, these descriptions overlap in different contexts, right? So we don't talk about one social model, we talk about many. Of course, the commonality of these descriptions, it's still related to the fact that you have a person with an impairment and you have a disabling society, right? What is the human rights model? Well, the human rights model is the model that was adopted by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is a UN human rights treaty that is the main focus is to protect persons with disabilities, people who have impairments, that in interaction with the barriers that are imposed in society, they cannot, are limited or restricted in the exercise of their rights, right? So this is the human rights model that is, of course, based on the philosophy of the social model, but it has its own pieces and nuances in terms of how to move forward. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities also it's a development tool, right? It's not only a typical non-discrimination human rights treaty, and we see that like on the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Protection on the CEDAW Convention, the Convention Against Discrimination of Women, and which are typical, non-discrimination treaties. The CRPD, it's not only, so the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it's not only a non-discrimination treaty, it is also providing like substantive guidance of how to implement these rights through policy implementation, right? So this is a key element also to understand what is it that the human rights model is proposing and how this should be impacting social protection systems. So now that we have a more clear understanding, right, of where these things are coming, how stigmatization is actually impacting persons with disabilities, how is this reflected in social protection systems, how charity model and the medical model social protection systems are designed for the exclusion of persons with disabilities, and how social protection systems should change to overcome this stigma, these discrimination structures, to include persons with disabilities in a way that instead of having disabling environments, you will have enabling environments for participation, right? So this is a situation that happens for all persons with disabilities. The third level that we need to look at this point in this conversation is what is happening in migration policies, right? And let me make a small parenthesis here in terms of the approach of migration that I will take. As you know, the human rights perspective on migration, it's a very broad logic, right? That it's looking at all kinds of people in the move. It doesn't matter if you have, you are looking for a refugee status, or you are looking for, if you are an internally displaced person, or if you are displaced by climate change, or if you are displaced by economic reasons, or by reasons that are connected to conflict or disasters in the region where you're living. Any person that it's on the move, that it's looking for a better future, and that it's should be considered a subject of rights, and that's the general protection that is given by the international human rights system to migrants, right? So I will be speaking from that point of view, just to be clear in the conceptualization. So from a migration perspective, migration policies, when they apply to persons with disabilities, they replicate the logics that already exist in social protection systems, health systems, education systems, that are part of the design of national policies, right? And this perspective adds to the existing ones. So the migration policies add to the existing perspectives in social protection structures, employment logics, and so on. They add the political dimension of migration, right? So from a political perspective, these two approaches to migration, either looking at integration from a general point of view, or looking at rejection as part of the political perspectives of a given country, applying also to persons with disabilities, right? And there is a differentiation. I mean, those that have a rejection approach from immigration policies tend to exclude all people. Nevertheless, of course, there are nuances to that, right? So if you are coming from high-income countries, if you are a professional, if you are part of a workforce that is underdeveloped in a given country, you may have, better opportunities to access to working visas or to other structures that within the migration policy. But when it comes to persons with disabilities, these aspects tend to be another reason for exclusion, right? Disability, it's seen in many contexts as a burden, not only to the structure of the migration policy, but also a burden to the existing systems themselves, particularly social protection systems, right? So there is a very clear-cut logic of this, and we can go later a little bit on the examples. How exclusion operates both within the integration approach to immigration policies and within the rejection approach in migration policies. Well, within the integration approach, there are countries that do allow for persons with disabilities to enter and to be part of their systems, but they tend to implement policies to access to social protection, for example, that are related to the impairment that people have, right? So, for example, they would tell you, and some of them are directly related to that. So, for example, they would say, yes, you can come to my country, but you have no social protection in my country until you can prove that you are a person that will have a specific income and that the structure is sorted out from a formal point of view. Something that is perhaps not required to nationals in many cases. I have to say, in many cases, it does apply to nationals. So many countries do not provide any social protection to persons with disabilities at all, regardless of the fact that they are working formally or informally in the country. But for migration purposes, this tends to be, I would say, a general rule. In a second level, also in the integration system, it could happen that countries establish a number of years, for example. May not be a disability specific policy, but definitely impacts persons with disabilities in a disproportionate way, right? So, for example, the country can say that in order to access to the social protection system, you have to have contributed to the system for 5 years or 10 years or so. Which can, definitely look at the situation of persons with disabilities that are working in the system, but it will openly exclude all children under 18-year-old that may not be working, or directly exclude all children for the period of time that it's there, right? So if you have to be 10 years in a country and you are under 10 years old, you then have zero protection from the system. So these are very common practices that we see around the world on how to exclude persons with disabilities or disincentive persons with disabilities to be part of other countries' development structures. You can also have open exclusion, as we said, from a rejection point of view. And this we see in many countries, right? Like you cannot even apply for a visa if you are a person with disability, or you cannot even apply for a refugee status, right? And there are many examples of a number of countries that if you are a person with disability, you are not considered under this line. I would like to conclude by perhaps giving you a little bit of a picture of what's happening at the international level and what has happened in the last years, and where the international level is in the conversation of social protection for persons with disabilities generally. Migration, I have to say, has and the structures on migration have paid very little attention to persons with disabilities at the international level. Because of the new strategy that was adopted in 2019, that's called the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, we now start to see how agencies like, the the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or the International Organization of Migration are starting to look at disability as a specific issue. And we are seeing now more and more work around this issue. The larger structure and international documents that were developed on migration, the New York Declaration, structures like that, have very, very few references to persons with disabilities. So the international framework is still not set up for the purpose of protecting persons with disabilities at international level. On social protection, on the other side, there have been many more developments. In the 1990s, the standard rules on disability were the largest framework, was a soft law structure that was providing many protections and considerations that are connected to social protection. And that was kind of the starting point for the international process. The adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006 was later, I would say, the next big step into making this a human rights issue that, of course, it's also including economic and social rights into that conversation. And finally, I would say that the third turning point in the international system was the adoption of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, that it's now has established an accountability mechanism to which all UN entities, including ours, it's accountable to. We need to report to the Secretary General on our actions on disability rights. It is very much embedded on the human rights model compared to what was in the past a more, I would say, loose framework of the standard rules, much more based on the social model. And now we have a very clear mandate from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, and also from a process point of view, that it's hopefully increasing the performance of the UN system in delivering for persons with disabilities. There have been some advancements in the Human Rights Council here in Geneva, looking at social protection, and that is moving forward. There is now actually a resolution that will be negotiated in March in the Human Rights Council that will be looking at this issue, right? We'll be looking at social protection and we'll have a disability perspective into it. And hopefully that will start to trigger mandates within the UN system in a way that more attention is paid to persons with disabilities themselves. So I would say that maybe we can stop there, Lisa, and maybe we can open a conversation between the two of us and other participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Facundo, for this thoughtful presentation. I will now give the floor to Lisa Borelli, who has some questions and comments to your talk. And afterwards, I suggest that you answer to these comments, and we will open the floor to other questions. Thank you, Lisa. You can go ahead.
Great. Yes. Thank you very much for this very exciting and inspiring talk. Also, thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to meet you, first of all. Unfortunately, online, as you mentioned, so maybe next time in person. It is also very nice, I think, this time that we talk about the topic of disability within the NCCR, because we haven't talked about this so far, or at least not in a major kind of perspective. And I think what I was intending to do now is I want to start off with a small field note that I actually came across when I read kind of about the event and we talked about the event, and now also kind of thinking about what you talked about, because there are so many issues and things you brought up. And I think this kind of maybe great for me to conceptualize it. And I want to start with this field note, which I collected during my data collection for my PhD when I observed migration practices in Switzerland. And it is a day in a migration office, which I visited for several months. And it's about a caseworker that reflects on a case he's currently working on, and it was 2017. And it's about, this case is about a Kurdish pair of siblings, a sister and a brother from Turkey who have fled due kind of like to Switzerland. However, they have received a Schengen visa from Sweden, and therefore should be actually deported to Sweden to make their asylum claim there, according to the caseworker. And he mentions then this caseworker, well, he's a poor guy, he says. Indeed, he was tortured. Then he started a hunger strike when they put him in jail until he was only weighing 40 kilograms. Then they let him go. That does not really happen often and quickly there. So apparently the caseworker tells me then that his sister took care of him under permanent control and surveillance of public authorities who checked upon him and whether he is able kind of to go back to jail and kind of being fit to jail. And obviously then they managed to flee. And he says then, well, he does not look very well up until now, actually, and is still weak despite him gaining weight. And he assumes then that this person has severe damage due to this hunger strike and has a couple of eventually mental and physical impairments that will affect his life. And here the caseworker then toughens up at some point and says, but it cannot be that we receive all these half dead. And I quote here. And then he starts calculating a bit and mentioned that even if he would only live in Switzerland for more than 5 years, so assuming that he lives for 5 more years and then dies, and I quote again, it would cost us a fortune. They, the sister and the brother, will never be able to pay taxes or to work. That is asylum abuse and not our responsibility. And then again, once the flight is booked for them to be deported to Sweden, he mentions again, they would cost us millions. He's half dead and severely disabled. And I think this kind of example kind of captures very important aspects that you mentioned, and that is that you kind of, well, talked about in your presentation now, and that kind of brings up, first of all, this development of these different models. So we have, as you said, this historicity of disability and how it has been perceived. But I also think it takes up quite well that you showed the segregation, right? That intersects with many other things, gender, class, race, and so on. And I thought it was very kind of eye-opening in the sense of that there's so many different groups which are marginalized, but there's a much overlap of many. And sometimes you don't even see kind of the differentiation anymore because it's so detailed and so interlinked. For example, as you said, that children are kind of suddenly neglected because they're disabled. And you're like, oh, you wonder, because there's a lot of talk about the kind of need of the child, the best interest of the child. And then you wonder, how can this happen? And then I was kind of also inspired by the moment when the United Nations, they mentioned that studies suggest that migrant workers with kind of lower skills or lower level of educations, for example, are exposed to higher risk of acquiring a disability, as they often are assigned to dangerous manual labor, right, construction work, and that obviously has kind of results in a higher frequency of accidents. And I also wonder then, how do systems and state structures, once people have migrated, also become kind of machineries of creating disability in that sense, not only kind of telling people who are already kind of coming with a disability or being attested with a disability, but also making them, for example, through labor exploitation and other ways of exploiting them, putting and making them vulnerable, or also forcing them to flee and not, for example, allowing for legal ways for them to cross. And then, I mean, as you mentioned as well, when you talked about migration and flight, that kind of disability might also be not only a consequence of kind of natural disasters and then forced displacement, but also kind of that there's this possibility that refugees with disabilities are more likely to be sidelined. Kind of, and then every aspect of humanitarian kind of assistance is kind of, well, not really taking care of them or kind of acknowledging them as beings, kind of due to physical, environmental, and social barriers which exist already, right? And I think one kind of, so today we face a system that is, then again, and that you mentioned when you mentioned the segregation, we face a system which is still, I think, I would argue, quite much in this charity model. when we think about kind of social protection, for example, we face a system that is based on economic labor market interest, right? So there's a high interest of people being active. We have, when we look at all the welfare literature, and I have to say I'm not a scholar who has worked on disability myself, so I'm also guilty of ignoring this field. But when we look at kind of welfare laws and policies, we see that we have an increase in activation logics. We have a retrenchment of welfare states, which actively want to push their kind of claimants or clients, let's say, to become active in the labor market, to become eligible. Only obviously for a certain time, because you can only be eligible as long as you work. And then I wonder kind of how much does this still feed into this charity model that we have in disability studies? And kind of how much then kind of does it propel an exclusion? And kind of like what kind of one question obviously would be kind of how do we kind of get this framework to change, like kind of to change these beliefs that are attached that you can only be a valuable human being when and if you participate in the labor market. And I think there then comes in what you also kind of showed quite greatly, is that it's not only the legal conditions and frameworks which exclude, and when you said, well, social protection is designed kind of to segregate and to kind of create exclusion, but it's also this purposeful kind of a moment, right? It's not only something which happens because the state doesn't think about it, but it actively strives for the exclusion of others. And I think here comes in a moral part, where we see kind of that some human lives are less worth than others. We see conditionality. And I think, for example, I was actually triggered now by the idea of this kind of binary of biopolitics and necropolitics, kind of this idea of, okay, the state has like social and political power to control and manage lives on the biopolitical side and does population management, but it also more and more has a kind of power over life and death. So it can actually say or decide how some people may live and some must die. And how much do we come further into this? And how much obviously we can learn from other kind of fields of as you mentioned as well, studies on racism, on gender, which have kind of supported this criticism. And I have a million questions, but I'm going to maybe take up a couple of them before I start, or I kind of stop talking as well. And one of them was obviously for me, a very obvious one is kind of what can research do? So what do you think, what type and kind of research needs to be done kind of at the intersection of migration and disability studies, for example? Kind of how would it support like a change of system? How can it be helpful to make issues more visible? And how kind of should we at the same time not reify these state-made categories of disability, right? So, and instead kind of critically deconstructed and this meaning, but also being able to kind of point these moments kind of, and then this purposeful neglect, let's say, of states, to the forefront. And then, well, I think I'm going to stop here, and I might have some more questions, but maybe I'm going to give you also time to answer and discuss, as you said, and maybe there's also then more from the audience. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I think they're all very good points. And thank you for bringing those concrete examples, right, of how it happens in real life. I can give you 3 trillion more examples that will go exactly in the same line. But I think it's really good that you brought your research into the picture, so we can talk about real people, right? I would start with the first point that you raised, right? The one that it's about preventing new impairments and how it works in the general system. As you know, the protection of persons with disabilities, and this is something very important to think about from a budget point of view, so from a policy implementation point of view. Countries tend to say, and I can give you examples from all over the world, it's not really something that it's a rich country or poor country kind of thing. Countries tend to say that they are working on disability when they are working on prevention of new impairments, right? So this is something very important to have in mind, because if I tell you that I am spending $100 on disability, and 80% of that is going to medical care systems for the whole population, social protection system for the whole population, specific measures on employment for certain populations. The example that you brought, right? Safety in care in employment. Then we are with this situation in which those $100 that you are saying that you are investing on persons with disabilities, actually 80% you are investing on something else, right? Like traffic accidents and many other stuff that could lead eventually to have an impairment, right? So this is very important. When we are discussing about disability rights, we're discussing about persons with disabilities, like what you characterize as those that come with impairment, right? So I think that's very important because I've seen it and we continue to see that like on mine action, on, you know, general migration purposes. I mean, all this stuff is kind of entangling these two realities, which are very different realities. And at the end of the day, you ask a country if they are doing something on disability and they will tell you, yes, we are investing millions and millions and millions in disability, but they are not working on the situation of people with disabilities themselves, right? So that I think it's a very important point. The second point is, what does it mean to be active, right? What is an active person in a society, right? That's something that I think it's important to have in mind. So let's try to take that logic, I mean, from an unemployment or employment point of view, if you are looking at, you know, statistical systems and how statisticians would manage to put a differentiation between an active population and an inactive population, or a population that is unemployed, let's say, just to take these three categories. The active population is that it's working effectively working, or it's looking for a job, right? Which then puts all these, I mean, if you look at numbers, your inactivity rates in a country are actually more than 60% of your population, right? You have older persons, you have people that are not working because they are taking care of, you know, the sick and people with disabilities in their houses. You have people that are children. So at least 60% of your population, depending on your demographics, but at least 60% of the population, it's an active part of your population, right? So the definition of activity or inactivity for the purposes of defining the value of a person should not be differential, let's say, when it comes to persons with disabilities. So there is where this incapacity to work starts to play, right? And you see this also in many contexts, right? So for example, when you are talking about social protection for children, for example, it's not the case of migration, right? But social protection for children, generally speaking, children with disabilities will have access to some kind of social protection pretty much in all countries, right? They may not be aligned with the objectives that we want to pursue. They may not be in line with, you know, planning a life of participation at this point. But definitely there is something there that it's covering children with disabilities in that line. What happens there is that discrimination operates by association, right? Because the larger demands of support that these children may have can actually be impacting the household and not the children themselves, right? So I think this is a very key concept that you are putting forward, which is how do we value people based on their capacity to be active, right? And also to integrate a larger picture of that. Another point that you also raised that is also connected to this is the gender perspective, right? So what is it that we're talking? First of all, we have a gender and disability intersectionality perspective that needs to be clearly addressed, right? Because women with disabilities have much less access to pretty much everything. And in addition, they are like 4 times more exposed to violence. So the numbers on women with disabilities are really off the charts. But also, let's look at this whole discussion of disability and social protection from a gender point of view, right? Unpaid care work, for example, which is basically another form that the structural that systems structure exclusion, and in this case, punishing, female parents of children with disabilities or people or female or women that are supporting older persons, right, with disabilities. So this duty of care, right, that it's very much associated with the stereotypes, gender stereotypes, that's imposed on women, definitely makes this agenda a women's rights agenda as well, right? So I think it's important to also bring that point into the conversation. The third point that you raised is what is it that we need to be looking at? What are the gaps, right? How research can contribute to this work and how we move forward. I think the first thing is to have very clear objectives, strategic objectives, I would say, for policy development and policy changes, right? And there is, I can tell you that there are gaps. For example, what is the dimension of unpaid care work for women with regard to their, to the imposed care duties related to persons with disabilities, whether they are children, people in working age, or older persons with disabilities, right? So what is that exact gap? Because we have the general gap of care, right? But the exact gap that applies to persons with disabilities is something to be better defined. And this is something that sometimes is very difficult to determine because data systems may not allow you to do that, that crossing of data in a very straightforward work. So you have to go through administrative systems. Again, looking at the segregation of systems, you will have to look at more than one system to actually get to that. And that cannot be done by quantitative analysis, right? That you need to go through research, through structuring administrative data collection processes, and to move from there to the next step, right? So I think research can do a lot on that front. The second point is, again, looking at the previous point that you made, looking at activity. And again, what is the role of persons with disabilities in a given society? Because this is something also that it's very important. I think we advance a lot in the conversations on this issue around the discussion of social protection floors. Right, so when we are talking about social protection floors, we're talking about many things. The first one, of course, it's connected to the well-being of people, right? And then you have income security in a way, that can make it work for you to have a dignity in your life and exercise that dignity through the enjoyment of your rights. Now, we are also talking about the financial structure, right? Because social protection systems, social protection floors are not only, good for ensuring well-being, but they are also a very important safeguard against financial crisis, right? Because you are keeping you are keeping a base of consumption in countries, particularly those that have higher risk of entering into financial crises, like middle-income countries and low-income countries that usually tend to be in a cycle of, crisis, recovery, crisis, recovery, crisis, recovery. And it's not the situation maybe for high-income countries that may have larger structures in place and that they are not only dependent on certain pieces of their economy. So that's the role of social protection floors. In that case, it's particularly important, right? And you have developed countries that do have that very well structured, right? Like you have it in Germany, you have it in France, you have it in Spain, you have it in Greece, where those social protection floors are actually operating in a large piece to sustain economic stability of these countries as well, right? So again, looking at the role that persons with disabilities play in these cases, we need to see at the whole care industry today. I mean, hopefully tomorrow we'll have a support industry and not a care industry that is looking at the engagement of persons with disabilities and others in a meaningful way in society. But that's another point that's very important, right? You have a number of studies that are looking at the return of investment of having persons with disabilities working living in the communities, right? And if, first of all, if that person can contribute to the economy, great, that will lower the costs that usually have a burden on social protection. But if those persons may not be in a position to be part of development today, or because there are structural gaps in employment that will never take them because employment design is not looking at that, and you have no structures that are looking at the inclusion of persons with certain impairments in the economy, as it happens a lot to persons with intellectual disabilities or persons with psychosocial disabilities or certain people with physical impairments and so on. So what is happening in that specific context is what is the value that these adults with disabilities are contributing to the structure. And that is where the social protection floor also plays a role, right? Because these financial matrices that you are building by supporting community living of these people are also creating jobs, right? They are also creating cash mobility in the country. They are also contributing to consumption of certain goods and services. All of that is part of it. And don't get me wrong, it's not the idea to exploit persons with disabilities as objects of care, but definitely there is a role that economies can benefit from through these processes, right? So, and it's also looking at the well-being of that person in particular and the realization of human rights, and as well as contributing to the larger economy. The numbers on, the care economy, for example, are in 2 billion in Europe, for example. And that's 2 billion euros that are being managed through the structures of social protection, right? And every euro that's invested on that, depending on the country, may range between 1.5 and 2.1 as a rate of return of investment in these systems, right? The question is there, should we, because there are other structures that may be offering equal or higher return of investment, right? But the question there is, should we sustain those ones that are not providing for the well-being of the person or not, right? Because institutionalized settings, for example, may have a higher rate in certain cases, but they may not be delivering, and this is what the human rights framework is saying, these are not delivering for the well-being of the person concerned, right? So this is a whole other conversation, but just to put also this point on activity as part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Robert, do you want
No,
to
thank
open
you
the
so
floor
much
already, or
for your reaction. Maybe you have another reaction, Lisa.
you like a small one?
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
thanks. I
So
think
go ahead, and afterwards we will open the floor to the other participants. As usual, you can raise your hand. But yeah, go ahead, Lisa, if you have a small
also obviously not
comment,
forced to
addition.
respond at all, but yes, no, thank you. Exactly. I think that what you mentioned now was, exactly these issues of kind of preventing these new impairments versus actually not counting them as part of, yes, we do actually something for a kind of invest in people with disabilities. And I think that was a crucial point. And I didn't think about it because you're right, actually, states can then say, hey, we did invest, but then it's actually going somewhere else. And it might kind of eventually prevent, but it's not actually targeting those who are actually already having an impairment in that sense. I have a question maybe regarding to this, and it's kind of connected to the acknowledgement of, let's say, new disabilities and what happens there, because I guess there's a lot of kind of areas also when we look at that kind of mental health conditions, right, that have been acknowledged recently and more. And can you say something about this historical development and if there's a kind of about how difficult it is eventually to get acknowledged? And I think the second part, I was wondering again, because you mentioned now rightly this that we have this kind of moment where incomes kind of and then kind of well, where people also create jobs in consumption, as you mentioned. And I thought it was interesting when we look at it that way because we have this obviously kind of this well, it's a capitalist neoliberal society which on one hand individualizes, right? So it doesn't look at what do you actually produce as a human being, as like in social kind of in your social field and in your kind of participation outside of the labor market. So then you evaluate as an individual, saying, well, you have to produce no matter what you consume, and that's how you kind of also indirectly create possibilities. But it's actually you. But at the same time, we have this change when we then look at frameworks of policies which generalize groups and discriminate them. So I think it's an interesting shift how the implementation of these policies is very individual targeted, but the policies themselves then create very stereotypical ideas. And I wonder, yeah, I mean, what your reflection on that might be. I think these are two more questions, and then I'm going to stop here in case there's more people who want to ask questions.
I think, I mean, those are very good points. The first one that is related to that value, right? And I would say then there I would go into the logic of exploitation for sure, right? Because this happens a lot with women, right? It's how and not only on the unpaid care work structures, but also for many other things, right? Look, the way that patriarchal structures in societies are putting women in a situation of where they are actually, by doing the education of children and so on, they are already making a huge contribution to the larger piece of what later will be the workforce and what later will be the larger contribution to the social protection structures. So in that sense, I would say it would be definitely unfair to discuss one situation and not discussing the other one, right? So I think this, what you were saying before, right? These nuances that are happening between groups are getting smaller and smaller. I think the understanding on that, it's also getting smaller and smaller because it seems to be that we have structured society systems that are looking only at a very small fraction of who is the subject of rights, who is the actual participant that we are looking at and we are measuring when we are deciding on what is participation and who is being part of the decision-making structures, right? I think that the discussions on gender studies are very much contributing to this logic. And some pieces of disability studies, and particularly the line of critical disability studies, also have been looking at this issue very closely. So I think we are very much talking about the same thing, right? The logic or the stigma, it's different. So that is what allows the identification, but at the same time, the structural logics seem to be the same, right? And this is something, there is a very common phrase that it's used that it says that disability creates poverty and poverty creates disability, right? And I think this logic it's wrong. I think what we are looking at is at the direct directional logic of how a society is structured based on this model of human that we want to be respected in their dignity and rights. And then everybody else that would fall later in the structure of that society, right? So I think it's very much unidirectional, more than a cycle that that's created by this. The second area that you raised, I think it has more to do with I mean the issue of prevention. I mean we have a whole prevention line of work, and I think it's important that's also highlighted because it's important for particularly for people that are doing research, and that a very concrete thing, you apply for a grant on disability and then you are doing your research on prevention of whatever, right? So, and we see that a lot, but a lot. Unfortunately, donors are also funding this kind of structure and say instead of saying, yeah, what you're doing, it's not disability, right? It's it might be health or it might be something else, but it's not definitely not disability. So that's also a good point to come back to. I'm missing the second point you made, so let me see because I think I took a note.
It was about the acknowledgement of new disabilities, I think.
Yes, mental health. So what is happening with so not only mental health, but there are a number of impairments that are being more and more recognized, right? And this has been really the history of the disability movement. You can start, with those initial actions in the 1600s from a charity perspective that were only looking at deaf people, right, or blind people, and everybody else was not even considered in the list, right? So there has been, of course, a larger recognition of different impairments, and many medical conditions have also led to functional disruptions, right? And that you start to see more and more recognized by internal systems as impairments as well, right? Which may grant you with access to a disability cards or include you within assessment methodologies that at the end of the day will grant you with some kind of social protection structure. Mental health, I would say it has taken a different path. It didn't come from the same perspective. It's of course extremely medicalized, and the biomedical approach to psychiatry and psychosocial support has a lot to do with these processes, right? It is also true that people with psychosocial disabilities, as we call it under the structure of the human rights system, people with psychosocial disabilities are a much underrepresented group in the general structures, right? They don't have, global networks that are influencing processes to the same level that people with physical impairments or people with that are blind or deaf people that do have these structures, right? So that movement, as a movement, it's very much in the lower side of the structure. Even you have people with different impairments, like people with autism or people with Down syndrome, that, I mean, particularly people with autism that were recognized as persons with disabilities by systems much later than others, but that have advanced much faster than others, right? So you see how autism, for example, in the last 15 years have really made a huge change, and the contribution of people with autism to the global discussion, it's huge, right? So this is a reality, right? And so the lack of mobilization of people with psychosocial disabilities and the oppressive structures where they are, right? Because there is almost no system in the world that gives persons with disabilities a voice, like with psychosocial disabilities, a voice over a psychiatrist, right? And you see that in criminal law and social protection, in health systems, pretty much all over, this substitution of the voices of persons with psychosocial disabilities is pretty much across the board, right? And with very much institutionalized systems, right? And I very much invite you to see at the work that our office has been doing in the council, in the Human Rights Council, around mental health and that perspective, because that system it's not providing for it what it should, right? Basically, what is happening today is that this is a space where violence, all kinds of violence, are well protected by mental health laws, right? And that can go from forced medication to restraints to the privation of liberty. I mean, the number of human rights violations are huge. And that is not the only problem. The problem is that the system is not set up to do what the system is supposed to be doing, right? So let me give you this example. You are a person with psychosocial disability. You are approaching a crisis, right? That you have to face, that you may be, facing extreme distress. And you approach a system, and the system, instead of giving you tools, be supportive and so on, what it does is to drug you, to put you in lockout, and to exclude you from your networks, and and deprive your liberty for, I don't know, X amount of time. And let's say that you overcome that. Let's say that you leave that system unharmed, or relatively less unharmed, and you can actually move from there. You go back to your community. What will happen the next time that you feel that you are going into that level of distress that you cannot manage on your own, right? Will you go back to that, or you will, stay in your own, try to find whatever solution that you can find, just to avoid going back into that, right? So that's something that is really an issue, and systems need to start looking at what is going to be the next step. There are a number of guidance that are coming. There are trillion practices around the world that are looking at changing coercive practices on persons with psychosocial disabilities. And they have proven extremely effective, right? So I think that's a promising field. Hopefully that will move forward very, very quickly.
Thank you so much, Facundo, and also Lisa, for these interesting discussions. Now I will give the floor to other questions or comments. You might raise your virtual hand or write your question in the chat as you want. The floor is open now. Discussion until 7:45. Yes, I see that Leslie has risen her hands. So you can go ahead, you can activate your camera and sounds and ask your question.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, so my one question is in tandem with what was just discussed about this type of violence. In the frameworks, what mechanisms are there or could be implemented to protect people with psychosocial disabilities from such violence? Like, in a way, what mechanisms are there for protection is basically my question.
Yes, there are a number of experiences around that, right? One of usually when you work on mental health, you have these three pillars. Leslie, if you can leave your camera open, great, so I don't speak to the empty screen. It's okay. So I think that you have like these three pillars that are to work, to socialize, and to live in the community, right? These three pillars are kind of particularly important. And there are many practices, starting from Trieste model in the north of Italy, to practices of community-based structures in India, or what is called the Parachute Project in New York. There are a number, I mean, all over the world, you have excellent practices in Girona, in Spain, where you can see what non-coercive structures look like, right? And you have them for people that may be more integrated into the development process, as well as for homeless people and so on, right? So the strategy around that is to avoid the person entering in a situation in which the person cannot manage that situation, right? That should be your first approach. And that's many times if you are a person that has difficulties to manage their distress, this can be triggered by many, many issues, right? Like the large number of issues that are connected to this are actually social, are not really related to the capacity of the person, right? So if you are exposed to, let's say, if you are a homeless person and you lived for a long time without, having access to a bed and a shower and so on, that builds up, right, in your capacity to manage the stress. And then at the end of that process, you may end up in such level of distress that instead of looking at the contention, let's say, or support kind of structure, you will end up, the system will deem you eligible, let's say, for a much more contained logic, right? And again, we go back to the social models, the medical models, and the charity perspectives, where you are taken from the system because you are disruptive, and then you are taken and you are put away, right? The psychiatric institution, whatever kind of system that will take you from, everybody's view, and that's it, right? So that's a reaction of the system logically today, right? And what it doesn't do generally is to provide that first support, frontline kind of first responder kind of thing, right? And there you have the first piece. The second one is to avoid coercion, right? No one wants to be coerced. Persons with psychosocial disabilities are not different to everybody else. And if you offer only a coercive measure as the solution, why would I engage with a system that is about coercing me at all, right? And in many cases, I mean, the number of examples on these are terrible and many, but it can go from something as simple as giving you a drug that, might make you dizzy and that you cannot think clearly, and then you don't want to feel like that. Why would you engage on that practice or that kind of treatment, right? So there are many other structures like peer support, for example, which are structures where you are facing this stress, you come to a group, you discuss it with the group. That group usually are persons that are facing similar issues as you are facing. And then between all of them, you can manage the situation. They may be supporting you to make decisions at that moment, and that's it, right? And you have peer support networks in the UK, in Kenya, in Latin America, and many countries. So these things are happening today. But they are not part of the structural system of mental health, right? Or they are not part of the structural systems of social protection, which is what people with psychosocial disabilities would like to have, right? Because it's difficult to put these kind of systems in health systems when health systems actually have been part of the problem for so many years, right? Hopefully they will change and they will be, aligning to a recovery perspective, but definitely this is not the way forward, right? So that's kind of the first thing, right? Like avoid engaging in a way the person that you are pushing the person away from the system instead of bringing the person in. I can give you, for example, an example in Girona. There is an organization that's called Support. And that organization, it has like this open space. So if you are a person that's a person with psychosocial disability, or you are a homeless person, you can go there. You will have clothes hanging on a thingy. You can have a shower. There will be a place where you can sleep if you want to. You can take a nap. There's no other people. There is no control structures in place. It's an open space, right? It aims at that you can benefit from that very, very basic support that is shelter, water and sanitation, food, and clothing, right? In Canada and in France, for example, you have this huge project that it's called Housing First. Housing First, it's about, I mean, what Housing First philosophy says is that if you don't have a place where to live and to organize yourself, it's very difficult that you will ever be out of that cycle of, abuse that many times is created in these coercive systems, right? So they have proven that with a very small amount of money, you can support a person to live in a house, and it's not an institution, and it's respectful of their situation. And that alone is reducing the numbers of, forced internment, and it's really looking at the recovery perspective of people within your own goals, right? That's the whole point of it. What you need to do is that people are making decisions to improve their lives according to their own beliefs, according to their own pace, and not according to what allegedly is normal, right? To recover from that situation. And you see excellent results on that, right? So that's another point that is very, very clear. Some countries have established, like in Peru, for example, legal prohibitions on forced treatment, and that is also helping to reduce the number of human rights violations in mental health systems, right? I think a combination of all of them, it's of course the way forward. Not every country can pay for all that, but I think there are many, many good experiences out there. We prepare a report from the office. We organized a consultation in 2018 on mental health that was addressing like good practices for inclusion. And then actually this week, last Monday, was a second consultation looking at coercive measures, right? So that's an important point. Unfortunately, there is still a lot of, medical model thinking behind it. And actually today, and these days, the Council of Europe is looking at adopting an optional protocol to the Oviedo Convention. The Oviedo Convention is the one that regulates ethical principles for medical treatment. And this optional protocol is basically allowing states to, implement coercive measures on persons with psychosocial disabilities, right? And it's a huge problem, not only because it goes against the convention, but also because it's really limiting the capacity of states to improve their systems, toward non-coercive structures. So hopefully a final reflection around that could happen in the council, and that process, can come to an end. Because what we see is that this is moving in one direction, right? It's moving in the direction of, more inclusive societies, more, respectful support, and, these quick solutions and this requirement of having, an infrastructure, a legal infrastructure that could allow to continue doing business as always. It's really a problem for the future of the implementation of the convention and for the system themselves, right?
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful because this was one of my main questions, and thank you for answering.
Yeah, thank you very much for this detailed answer. I think we have time for one last question or comment before we close the session. So don't hesitate if you have think there are no other questions from the audience. So if that's not the case, oh yeah, I see Catherine Lac, who has a question or comment. You can go ahead, Catherine. Maybe just I will give you possibility to unmute your microphone, and maybe you want to activate your camera. Yeah, you can go ahead.
I'm sorry because my English is very bad. So I don't know if I can speak in French and someone can translate. Ok. Moi, je voulais vous remercier parce que j'ai trouvé très, très intéressant. Moi, je suis une praticienne de terrain concernant le droit aux prestations de l'assurance invalidité, hein, on appelle ça comme ça en Suisse, c'est un nom assez horrible en fait. Les personnes, elles sont invalides, donc des personnes immigrées ou étrangères invalides. Et en fait, la Suisse est terrible en fait, parce que la loi sur l'assurance invalidité est une loi qui stipule, en fait, qui met en avant, qui promeut, qui est fière même de ça, de la réadaptation prime la rente, en fait. Mais la réadaptation, c'est quoi? C'est le travail. Et c'est vraiment terrible. C'est terrible. Donc, je sais pas. Et toutes les dernières révisions de cette loi ont été dans ce sens-là. Et c'est de pire en pire, et je pense qu'on n'arrivera pour l'instant pas, malheureusement, à changer cette tendance. Donc voilà, ça me fait beaucoup de bien d'entendre tout ça. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui travaillent un peu dans le système social en Suisse qui sont tout à fait conscients de ça, mais malheureusement, même quand on fait des référendums, ça ne passe pas parce que c'est toujours le problème de ça coûte trop cher, ça coûte trop cher, ça coûte trop cher. Et notamment tout l'aspect aussi des maladies ou des personnes qui ont des handicaps dits psychiques en fait. Ça a vraiment été le motif ces dernières années pour baisser en fait l'accès aux prestations de l'assurance invalidité en disant que c'était beaucoup des demandes qui étaient faites par des personnes qui avaient entre guillemets des maladies psychiques qui étaient en augmentation et que ça coûtait beaucoup trop cher en fait à la société. Voilà. Donc merci beaucoup pour votre intervention, c'était très intéressant.
Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing the experience in Switzerland. I think it's one of the big challenges, right? To look at not only in Switzerland but also in many other countries, to look at what is the new narrative, right, and how that narrative can change, right? There are many countries that are in the same situation as Switzerland, without the money, and here I think what it's really necessary, what's happening in pretty much all over Europe, is to look at a serious conversation of how persons with disabilities and their voices can be better reflected, right? And I think that's at the core of the issue at the European level, I would say. You have like very good practices in some countries, but the larger majority of perspectives on persons with disabilities in Europe, including persons with psychosocial disabilities and so on, it's very much stuck, right, on what it was the 1960s and the 1970s. This conversation has not publicly evolved in many countries, right? And the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been, in their country reviews, they have been very concrete in the recommendations that they have made, right? And you see that, like, for example, the conceptualization of disability in existing legislation, right? And this is a very clear indication of where your country is with regards to person with disabilities. If you say that person with disabilities are those that cannot walk, cannot see, cannot hear, or whatever, and there is no social intellection, and there is no evaluation of the context in that sense, well, basically you are still reflecting a logic in your policies that are, you know, again, from the 1960s and 1970s. And it sounds difficult, right, in 2021, to be saying that something has the logic of 1960. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem. I know that there is of no consolation, but the UN system is in the same situation, right? So these structures that were designed after the Second World War are still very much there, right? And they never thought that they were going to have persons with disabilities actively involved in anything, right? I tend to give these examples like, the lack of accessibility of podiums in the UN system, or the lack of social protection structures for us to be participating on equal basis with others, right? Like coverage of extra cost, or coverage of assistive technologies, or coverage of, human support that you may need, like personal assistance. All that it's not part of that conversation, right? Luckily, we are now, because you have persons with disabilities in the system, and we are in positions that are promoting, human rights perspective on our collective. The system started to react and to say, okay, now that we have you on board, we can start changing the system, right? But it will not happen if persons with disabilities themselves are not at the forefront, right? If those voices are not heard, and if those voices also do not promote a vision that it's looking at inclusion and participation, it will be very difficult, right? I think that this is very much associated to what we were discussing before with people with psychosocial disabilities, right? And that definitely needs to change.
Thank you so much, Facundo, for these reactions, and thank you also to Catherine for her question and comment. I think we will close the session here, but just before we do so, I have two small announcements, just to let you know that tomorrow we will continue somehow this discussion with the workshop organized by Leslie and Lisa, where we will look at different categories of migrants' access to social protection. And I really look forward to it. And if you need some information about it, please send me an email. This is for tomorrow, and also to let you know that on the 9th of December, we will have the first session of our academic conversations around thought-provoking questions on migration and mobility. Heinde Haas and Anita Manachal from our University of Neuchâtel will be invited to share their views on the following topic: too tough or too soft, the truth about migration policies in Europe. So you are, of course, invited to participate in this event. And I would like to thank again Facundo for his really thoughtful talk. I learned a lot, I have to say, and thank you again to Leslie and Lisa for having organized this event. Thank you very much and have a nice evening. Bye.
Bye, thank you.